Good afternoon, everyone. I guess we should get moving because we don't have a lot of time. I'm James Newell from Monitoring Valuation Research. I guess I also wear a hat for the Population Association. And I'm going to talk about a project, a kind of program I've been involved in for the last two and a half years in Christchurch, which I'm describing as sort of a barefoot statistician approach to monitoring and recovering Greater Christchurch for one or anything else. I mean, a lot of my work tends to be, in the back end models and things like that. So, how do I go? Yeah. So, wearing my hat in the New Zealand Social Impact Assessment, we had a conference on November 2011. As part of that, I thought we're having it in Christchurch about natural disasters. Let's have a discussion about the population of climate effects of the earthquake, a separate little workshop. And so that's really where things started. And through that sort of locked me into a process of getting drawn in over 2.5 years into doing numbers on Christchurch, but not necessarily, sometimes official, sometimes not official, in a way sitting between sort of government and community to some extent. And in that there was, if you like, quite a very large technical component in terms of methods and things. One of the key things for me first was developing a single year of age annualised population accounting framework, which was 3 months of intensive work before I actually started talking about things. And then I held a public seminar, I think it was March or April, and that had about 120 people. It was amazing, really. And that's where that started the series of, because Christchurch is a bit like, it's a sort of creative chaos. And the thing is, because it's a kind of a process which is in developing, sort of feeding information out as you got it from different sources, trying to put together the stories. And I guess every session I'd try and talk about a big story from what I've been looking at and some monitoring data. So regular seminars, and that sort of brought together a range of people, central, local government, people from like school principals, social service agents, sports groups, other community organisations, about who came along to the sessions. Unfortunately, from the first public seminar, I had to charge because I didn't have the funding for it. So that sort of cut down numbers, but it was, so that's the kind of the overall process. In terms of that was basically, you can think of in terms of, I guess, playing a role as independent public commentator, because it's difficult within government sometimes to talk about what you know, but if you're sitting outside of it, it's a bit easier for me to talk about things because I don't have to worry about some of the political issues about, is this the right thing to say? Because there's a real thing about saying the right thing in terms of government communications. But there's quite an underlying thing of science, applied science, technology, applications, and communication. Technology being quite rich in what it's doing. Technology in terms of building models and tools. Critical evidence base, and having worked a lot with the census, and increasingly the Christchurch earthquake and things before that made thinking about using a wide range of other sources and reconciling integration of different sources was a key thing. And also about process and relationship. The seminars and workshops is about getting out there and talking about data, which is an interactive thing because you have the numbers, but interpreting it is a critical, in terms of someone involved in social impact assessment, the role, if you're doing statistics on something, that interpretation thing, you may have a story, but understanding what's behind is another thing. Sharing data to and from agencies, and then a key thing is in terms of online results and resources, which is something I've just started to get into more now. So looking at some key things, the population accounting model, that was a key initial thing, sort of give a way of looking at and understanding what was happening with the population, because it's about understanding flows, a key thing in terms of migration particularly. So that's one key aspect, and that's something that was validated by looking at what stats, because effectively in that there's, a lot of things, but there are some things you don't know, and then seeing what other people had arrived with the same thing provide a way of validating it. Another thing following on from that, having done that, was a population estimates model, which we used for the June 2012 year, and then moving on from that using administrative statistics and official statistics and whatever to estimate a range of things. Specifically, one of the things which is quite interesting was getting a picture of the ethnic movements, by ethnic population, also starting out in the first year or so more looking at the regional strategic, then moving down to suburb level changes. And then I think at the moment looking at census data, so looking at the moment really sort of trying to understand the pattern of change using the census data. So that's sort of some levels of it. The key thing is this population accounting framework where in a way you can get all of this stuff, but this is the thing which one doesn't know. So effectively what I did with the population accounting framework was one could sort of measure a lot of these things and then get an estimate of what the net migration was, and from that deduce what stats are saying what internal migration was, because not all those assumptions are released, but it's very important if you're understanding the process of change, it's about knowing those assumptions. So I guess looking at that just in terms of how well did it work? So this is looking at the population accounting model. So this is about net migrations. This is saying how close was the net migration I'd estimated, without knowing what SAT's assumptions about net migration were to what I'd estimated using the population accounting model, and they're pretty close. So that was kind of reassuring. It's always nice to have a way of validating stuff. So that's kind of some of the underlying technical sort of underpinnings. I guess next thing was we're sort of early 2012. We really don't know what's happening. When is the recovery process going to start? SAT's estimate's going to come out in October, and it was a critical stage. So what I did is having done the accounting framework, then did an estimates model, and so that was done in August. And it wasn't just because SAT's estimate on an annual basis, so I tried to look at what was happening during the year. Because when you look at what happened during the year, that 2012 year was a turnaround year. So if you look from June 2011 to June 2012, there was a reduction in population, but we understood that in that last quarter of 2012, suddenly there was this turnaround, so you could see the turnaround in population. So this was some of the numbers coming out of that. In terms of these are the components, this is what the differences were, you can see the differences over time. I'm going to skate very quickly because we don't have much time. But critically for me, again, validating, how did they compare? When SATs came out with theirs 2 months later, how close were they? Well, this is the difference. So that's almost within rounding. So that's kind of nice. So, the thing is, I think the thing is that we've got official statistics, we've got SATs does, but when you come to a local level and applied level, quite often you have to add value. And for that, you need to, if you like, take what SATs say, okay, this is a benchmark. Do I agree with that disagreement? How do I tweak it to reflect these different scenarios? That's why this kind of approach is quite important at a local level, not just in the terms of Christchurch earthquake, but in every case, really, in terms of local government and local operations. So just moving on, at the moment we've got the 2013 census. This is what I was working on yesterday, not so much my presentation. So this is looking at the net migration by age for Greater Christchurch. So the 3 TAs, so effectively they make up the labour market, and that's the area where most of what's happening in terms of population is taking place. So this is the 2006-2013 net migration estimates using the single year of age data and the vitals that were released. The single year of age data was released on the 11th of March by SATs at all different levels, and this is what had happened in previous periods in terms of net migration, just going up to those age groups. And you can see this kind of effect of this movement of children, particularly, which was a key aspect of the population effect of the earthquake. So it's just a range, some of the numbers. There's a lot of data. A lot of what I did was looking at suburb level, and a lot of what I'm looking at the moment is looking at suburb level effects. So you've got the strategic, regional, strategic, local. But critical thing is this is the process of doing some analysis, then having a seminar discussing it, and maybe having other people talking about some of their work, and having that that's been something I've done every 6 or 8 weeks for the last 2.5 years. Okay. So funding and resources, mainly unfunded, some crowdsourcing, some contract outputs, some seed funding for Natural Hazards Platform. So demonstrated methods, successfully signalled major shifts a couple of months before anyone else knew about them. It gave us a definitive basis of talking about some of the shifts. Process, getting information out there because I think part of the thing is you've got in government, but out there 95% of recovery is actually not, it's not necessarily government, it's other people in the community. So giving the information was part of the thing. So lessons, I think objective, independent conduit of information. I think in a way there's an important role for that. Shift from medium to, for me, a lot of the work we think traditionally is thinking medium to long term. Christchurch, looking at short term, what's happening in the next month, the next year, which is quite a different way of thinking about demographic change, and a test bed for methods of integrating range of data. And I think you talk about evidence of policy, but what really interests me is evidence of operations. It's that, you're planning a school, how many students, it's that kind of operational. There's a policy, but there's an operational level. And I guess for me, what really interests me is this operational level. And I guess there's the questions on the role of supporting independent, non-government, non-academic research. Is not so easy. I think it's an important role, and I think there's, certainly it's not the most straightforward area to work. There's my quick run through.
Tēnā koutou, good afternoon. Look, in the aftermath of the Canterbury earthquakes, there was a hunger for information, and I think that's true of any disaster. So I'd like to discuss how Statistics New Zealand responded to post-earthquake information needs by focusing on population. Then I'll talk about some broader initiatives and lessons. So there was considerable interest in how many people had left Christchurch after the earthquakes. where they'd gone, if they'd come back, and if so, when. And in the absence of official figures, there were a multitude of numbers being bandied about. Just a few examples here. And what these figures were purporting to measure wasn't always clear. Were these residents of Christchurch or that had departed, or did the figures include visitors? And what were the figures being compared with? Now, in time, official population estimates, new projections and census data were released that did shed some light on these population movements, but getting to that point took time. And on the face of it, counting people is easy, but people are highly mobile, and defining and measuring a population of interest is actually much more difficult than it appears. Statistics New Zealand has a long history of drawing on administrative data sources to help measure the population and population change. And the data sources that they've drawn on includes international travel and migration data, which in itself provided regular monthly information on the impact of the earthquakes on people moving out of Christchurch and Canterbury and into Canterbury and Christchurch. But when it comes to population, it's the internal migration component which is most uncertain. Where are people moving from and to within New Zealand? And the school rolls and the electoral enrolments are useful. But in that post-quake environment where there are sudden and significant demographic shifts occurring, we were of the view that we needed to draw on further data sources to maintain the quality of population estimates and to maintain the confidence of data users in those population estimates. And of course, we weren't just measuring population change in Christchurch, we still had to measure population change in the rest of the country. So nationwide data sources were and are always preferable. And of these, the PHO enrolments and LEAD proved to be most useful. Certainly for measuring the resident population. Now, the cell phone data deserves some comment, and in an immediate post-disaster situation where the interest might be in where people have gone, regardless of how long they might be there, then the cell phone data offers potential to provide very timely information. And to these data sources, we can also add some very localised data sources that also proved useful in the case of Greater Christchurch. So what do we take from all of this? Well, none of these data sources are perfect for measuring the population. They all have weaknesses in terms of coverage, especially in terms of the age groups that they cover. We know they have differential coverage in terms of males and females and ethnicity. We also know that they vary in their timeliness, so that is how quickly they pick up changes in address of people moving. And for those of you interested in understanding more about those strengths and weaknesses, there's 4 papers I referenced there that are all on our website. So we're dealing with multiple imperfect data sources, but collectively they actually gave us, Statistics New Zealand, confidence in the population estimates that we produced and published post-quake. What about some of the broader initiatives? Well, I ought to start by noting that Stats New Zealand did have some pre-quake initiatives in place, and that certainly came in useful with the disruption to our Christchurch office and its 250 staff and their families and homes. So that contingency planning did enable business continuity with the scheduled release of information largely unaffected. Some tough decisions were made around postponing field collections, and underlying these decisions were sensitivity to the plight of respondents, but also concerns about the quality of coverage and response that was likely in these surveys. One of the first initiatives post-quake was the establishment of an earthquake information portal on the Statistics New Zealand website. It was essentially a link to reports and data from any agency that might help those responding to the earthquakes. It was on this portal, for example, that the school rolls data was updated weekly soon after the quakes, and that gave some information around the actual dislocation of people and return flows back to Christchurch. And it's fair to say that in that post-quake environment there was a lot of empathy and goodwill from both public and private agencies in supplying data, and considerable effort did go into building relationships with new data suppliers to access and understand the data they had. Subsequently we saw a lot of Christchurch and Canterbury specific analyses in various releases. For example, the retail trade implemented a quarterly Christchurch indicator which continues to be published. And of course Stats New Zealand doesn't need to be the only one publishing data, and indeed there were many other bulletins that assimilated and published statistics. So all these initiatives I think can be considered as successes, but what about some of the broader lessons? Well, there's no doubt that all statistics rely on respondents and or data suppliers, and maintaining and building relationships with both is a key ongoing challenge. Now in the case of respondents, they don't want to be bombarded by a plethora of surveys from insurance companies and market research companies, local councils or government agencies. So coordination of effort I think could be better. In the case of data suppliers, well, access to data is not a given. If you think a data source is going to be helpful to your work, especially in a post-disaster situation, don't wait for that disaster to begin the conversation. Start that conversation now. Disasters don't respect administrative boundaries, so certainly flexibility in providing statistics, which is sometimes as simple as just aggregating and outputting data in different ways. And I think it's also a reminder that people are interested in their communities. So national level statistics are important, but people and media generally relate better to regional and local statistics, where they themselves are more obviously part of the story. Now, as data sources evolve and more become accessible, we have the challenge of harnessing those data sources. And as they're inevitably imperfect, they really cry out for statistical models, such as the Bayesian models that are currently being developed. Now, we know there are still gaps in statistics, and often one of those gaps is around timeliness. Can official statistics be produced quicker, perhaps by compromising data accuracy or coverage? Well, I mean, that's a vexed question, but that's the sort of conversation that data users might want to have with producers of statistics. The earthquakes did generate demand for more frequent subnational population estimates, and official population statistics are evolving to the stage where that may be possible, but they are not there yet. The earthquakes also highlighted that there are different populations of interest. Now, many sectors such as education and health are generally interested in those people that usually live in an area and using schools and health services, but other sectors, civil defence, retailing, housing and rental accommodation, transport, they may be interested in broader population definitions, and certainly in the case of Christchurch, visitors and temporary workers are a really important part of the post-quake landscape, and potentially omitted, at least partly, from official population statistics. So flexibility to measure different service populations remains an unmet challenge. Now, the earthquakes also highlighted that there were some limitations of New Zealand's traditional census model, that is, of mobilising a large field workforce to distribute and collect forms, which are then processed and the results disseminated. So alternative census models, whether they be linked data sets or something more extreme such as a population register, might be more flexible in terms of adding new questions. They might be quicker in providing results, and they might provide results from multiple points in time. They might even be less onerous for people to complete, and they might reach some subgroups better than the traditional model. So I note that future censuses will be discussed in more detail tomorrow afternoon. And my final point is that, yep, there is hunger for information in any post-disaster situation. And although there might be more that national statistical agencies can do, continuing to provide independent and authoritative official statistics is still hugely important in a post-disaster situation.
I suppose where I'm coming from is from a user's perspective, and I also want to less focus on the data and also focus on some of the key questions that we tried to resolve, and also how does the information differ from business as usual? And I'm not going to look at any of the geophysical data, but I think it's what do we want to understand, what are some of the temporal and spatial scales that change as a result of a significant event like the Christchurch earthquakes, how good was the data at meeting those needs, and what should be done to make sure that we're actually in a better place if this happens again. We're in Wellington, it's a lovely day out there. I think the Wellington people who live here probably go, I hope the big earthquake doesn't happen in my lifetime. Those people in Christchurch go, I hope the big Wellington earthquake doesn't happen while I'm visiting. But at some stage, something's going to happen. And how do we make sure that we've learnt the lessons from Christchurch and can move on? Oops. I suppose this is just an example of some of the key questions, but I've also put on the top scale sort of the timeliness of them, because there's some immediate questions which happened in the first 0 to 3 months, some short-term, medium-term, and then long-term type questions, and lots of those are relevant over multiple time periods. And the things like what area is impacted, who is impacted, and I think these questions are both relevant for people as well as for businesses. So, which businesses, where in the city, how big was that, is just as relevant as the people. So, so you can replace people in housing with businesses and employees quite easily. So what are the implications of those areas being affected or those people being affected? And as you can see, there's short-term implications as well as medium to long-term implications. Simple things like Kim was saying, where are people living? Initially, it was how many people have left Christchurch? How many people are living in some form of temporary accommodation? When will those people return to Christchurch? Will they return to Christchurch? So it requires an understanding of people movements. Kim mentioned internal migration. Also, at the same time, people are trying to understand how will this impact on the future of the city. So there's decisions about the immediate impact on the city, but also will this impact 10, 20, 30 years away? When will we get back to business as usual? Often they're not the immediate questions, but as soon as you get beyond that initial response and into the recovery, that's just as important. How big will the influx of workers be? Can ask MB about that, they know the answers to all that. How long, when will it occur, and how long will it take? That has really important implications for the speed of reconstruction. If we don't get the workers, we don't get the houses built. If we don't have the housing, we've got nowhere for the workers to go. If we don't have the workers, Central City won't get rebuilt as well. So a lot of it ties in together. And the same with the following question. So what I want to do is just focus on the frequency of data, and especially in the context of the timing of the issues. So from the immediate through to short term, medium term, and long term. And if you look at this table, essentially, like Kim was saying, immediately after the earthquake, there was Ministry of Education data about school roll movements. the scale of that was weekly. We needed to understand what was happening every week. As the recovery moved into sort of the short-term phase, we're looking for monthly, quarterly data was useful. And we're probably in that medium term now at the end of 3 years after the earthquake. We're still interested in what's happening on a month-to-month basis. Quarterly data is useful, and annual data is starting to give us a big picture. And then long-term, again, you're moving out of the short-term data needs and into sort of quarterly through to, essentially census. And like Kim said, census isn't actually that good when you're dealing with issues, at this scale, temporally. So another important thing is lag. I think someone mentioned it earlier. For example, business demography comes out annually, but we have to wait 9 months for it to turn up. That means it's up to 20 months out of date before we get a new refresh. So it's just as important that timeliness of data as well as frequency needs to be considered. I've highlighted the annual and greater than annual boxes because that's the area where local government and probably central government usually operates in. We're less worried about the weekly, quarterly, monthly stuff. Actually, normally it just gets a bit messy, and actually annually is usually good enough. And also, actually, we need to have data because decisions get made whether there's data or not. Whether they're the right decisions, only time will tell. This is an example of where we used to be. This is external migration annually, so annual trends. Just focus on the dark green line, which is net external migration sort of per year. This is the monthly data, so you can see, and it's actually only for that period there. So you can see there's a lot more noise. There's a lot of stuff happening in there. Some of that's seasonal, some of it's just month-to-month variation. You can see very clearly what happened after the earthquake. Quite a few people left Christchurch. Now we're getting up to flows that are almost as high as what we had in the mid-2000s. So it's just, you need to deal with different types of data or the same data in a different way. This is a new data set that we collect. It's building consents for replacement dwellings. So these are houses being rebuilt. Essentially, it's houses where there was a demolition and one or more houses have gone on the site. So you can see historically there was a few happening. This is essentially houses that are no longer economical to repair but need to be rebuilt. The next scale is spatial scale. Up the top I've got concepts that most people relate to, ideas of community, neighbourhood, suburbs, towns and cities, rural areas. They're things that resonate to people. If you go and describe where you live, you start with either the town or the city you live and the suburb. Things like territorial authorities and regions are essentially constructs. They're administrative boundaries for administrative purposes. Actually, most people care about that area, and that's the scale of the effects. Suburbs are affected, towns are affected, and that's going to be the case for any other ongoing natural disaster. However, if you want high frequency data, it's at these scales here. To be honest, Canterbury is meaningless to Christchurch. What's happening in Timaru? What's happening in Tekapo? Those things aren't relevant to what's happening in Christchurch. So I think that's a lesson that Stats New Zealand and other government agencies need to think about. Regional data isn't good enough. And this is just an example of unoccupied dwellings in Christchurch. So you can see these are the areas that are affected. This is part of the Christchurch city boundary. So we're talking about suburbs. Then if you look at the residential red zone, which is sort of the red blodgy bit in the middle, the blue bits are mesh blocks, so that's the finest scale. Even at the finest scale we get data, it doesn't match the area defined as the residential red zone. So in summary, I think there's two key data gaps that I want to emphasise, and Kim mentioned it. Internal migration at the moment is dependent on the census. It happens every 5 years. There's quite a few bits and pieces that were pulled together that gave us a picture of it, like which Kim mentioned, but if we want to be in a better place for the next disaster, we need to have better internal migration data, and that's dependent on administrative data. I think housing is another area where most of the information comes from the census, or a lot of the data is at a regional or even a greater than regional area. Like housing affordability in Christchurch is reported for Canterbury and Westland, so that includes Greymouth and Westport. The other thing when you're talking about natural disaster is concepts like habitability. You know, can someone live in a house? You know, unoccupied dwellings gives us part of the picture, but an unoccupied dwelling might be habitable, and the reason why someone's not living in there isn't because it's habitable or not. After the earthquake, there was assessments of a whole lot of houses, and the standard way of assessing it is it safe or is it not? Safe is different to whether it's habitable. I've got some relationship issues. EQC is to us what the police and Ministry of Health is to the Salvation Army, and I'll leave it at that. I think we need to make the most of some of those innovations that Kim mentioned, like the cell phone data. Those relationships need to be built and developed now, not post-earthquake. They need to be ongoing, and you need to be building services or products out of those with the idea that maybe you're only doing it annually, but if there's a need, it can then be scaled down at a much more frequent level. I think the other thing I want to mention is central and local government talk different languages, and we operate in different ways. And you have to be aware of that in a situation like this, or actually probably ongoing, but we have different political masters, we operate in different ways. And I think over the last 3 years, there's been a case of we've been talking past each other. So I think that's really important, and it's probably something that needs to be developed going forwards. So thank you.